I continue my lecture on the Golden Age by turning to a comics master, Will Eisner. Contrary to what Mark Raxton told us in Ultimate Spider-Man number 78, Will Eisner did not invent comics. He did not invent the graphic novel. But he did, perhaps more than anyone else, live the 20th century life of comics. And by all accounts, he lived it with a tremendous generosity, both an imaginative and creative generosity in which he gave the world wonderful stories, but also a teacher's generosity in which he taught many people how to create tremendous comics. Eisner began writing Sacco for Wow magazine in 1936, in the beginning of the comics pamphlet. From there, he teamed with Jerry Iger to become a comics packager, creating new content for comics publishers. That is, people who are looking to get into the comics business from a publishing perspective could turn to Eisner and Iger and buy comic stories. From there, he went on to create his own comic, The Spirit. The Spirit was under his control, and it's the story of a kind of undead superhero who is both a superhero and a kind of crime noir character. Eisner did some tremendously creative work. After doing The Spirit, he went on and created army training manuals using the comic book format to teach people how to use army material through comics. After that, he left comics and became a publisher. And for years, that's what he did. And it wasn't until 1978 that he returned to comics, but return he did, and with a vengeance, creating A Contract with God, a major comic story, actually a collection of stories, which take comics to a new dimension, really, thinking about very profound and sophisticated questions. What is our human relationship to God? Eisner did a lot of long-form comics, and among those, in 1985, he created the comics textbook, Comics and Sequential Art, really a wonderful teaching manual for comics and an education for all its readers. In 1986, he produced an autobiography telling of the Golden Age, and it is to this autobiography that I would like to turn, The Dreamer. The Dreamer fictionalizes many of the characters of the early Golden Age and tells the story from Eisner's perspective, intermingled with his own story of becoming a man. I would like to turn to a particular page of The Dreamer, a page, I think, that gives us a poem on the grid. Looking at this page, and I'll read it to you, I want you to think about the levels at which the grid, the concept of the grid, is working. So, Eisner and Iger have just put out their advertisement for comic book illustrators for their new packaging company. Look at that lineup! Wow! One little advertisement in the Times, and we got 50 artists applying. We only need 15. How'll we set up, Billy? We'll set up like this. I'll sit in the center and lay out stories. Pass the lettered pages to the pencil and ink people along the left wall. They'll pass the inked pages up the other side of the shop for backgrounds and cleanup. Looks more like an Egyptian slave gallery than a comic book studio. Good news, Billy! We just landed Doggy, the British Comic Weekly, and we'll have to speed up our output. The only shortcut I can think of is to pre-print pages with blank panels, which the artist can then fill in. Cuts production time down. But I do hate to do that. The quality of the layouts will suffer. Oh, be practical, Billy. Stop dreaming. We're a production shop, not an art gallery. Print the pages! So, The Dreamer continues, and Eisner decides to leave Iger and go on to do his own comic, The Spirit, turning away from this Egyptian slave gallery of comic book production. But I want to turn to this image, this page, and think about how the grid works. By just looking at the page, you can see there are 3 clear tiers. In the first tier, we have a long shot that shows us all the artists lining up. In the second tier, we're outside of the building entirely, floating, I guess, in space, looking in the window listening to Eisner's plans. In the third shot, we're in some indeterminate space. The background seeps in, but we're in an office, listening to them talk through the problems. Of those three tiers, I think you can easily see that the page divides quickly in two. Maybe we could call this a 2 by 3 grid. Arguably, it's also a 3 by 3 grid, and that opening in the top tier, the opening in which the crowd is coming out of, is the first panel, and then they cross over the third panel, and then they enter into, under Iran and Samson, the fictional name of Eisner and Iger, they cross into the third panel. I think we could call this a 3 by 3 panel grid or a 2 by 3 panel grid. It's arguable. But there are more grids, because instantly we look and we see the page is about grids. In the bottom tier first panel, Eisner is holding a pre-printed page of 3 by 3 grids. And in the very next panel in that tier, he's somewhat sadly coloring in the grid, maybe daydreaming as he does, thinking about how the quality of the layouts will suffer. So not only is the page laid out according to a 3 by 3 grid, but it also features a page of a 3 by 3 grid. But there's more still, because those artists in the window are arranged, surprisingly, in a 3 by 3 grid. There are 3 artists per row and 3 artists per column. On top of that, the window frame itself creates a grid. This one a 4 by 2 grid. But that frames them, just as Eisner says that he's going to organize them, and just as Iger says it's an Egyptian slave gallery, they're kind of imprisoned behind the bars of the grid of the window. But on top of that, the brick background of the building which frames that window, in fact, frames the second 2 tiers of the entire page, creating a kind of wall. Instead of a real evolved interior, we are held with a wall in which the bricks are grid themselves. Even more than that, the filing cabinet that Iger is filing some things away in seems to be a 2 by 3 grid, which takes us back to the possible 2 by 3 grid of the page itself. The page is a poem of the grid. But in this, it is tremendously ambivalent about what Eisner is creating. It is saying that the grid is both a format for producing comics, but it's also imprisoning comic artists. It's also shackling them to a particular format in which they have to work. Within that, Eisner is holding to the grid, showing that he too works with it, but he's also trying to figure out ways to use that very enshackling structure creatively. And so he multiplies grid upon grid upon grid to get his point across. It recognizes the problem of creativity, the problem in which the imagination would be free, but needs structure for expression. This is the essential struggle that I've pointed out since the beginning of my lectures. This page is a poem about the grid, and it tells us that the grid both enables and contains the artist. And as such, it is an analogy, a metaphor for the Golden Age itself. The Golden Age is said to move from 1938 to 1955, and in this, it is certainly a point of origins. It is thought to be a golden age, a wonderful time in which comic books evolved and were free to explore. But Eisner shows us here that the shop system develops at the same time, and the shop system is a double-edged sword indeed, because the shop system both employs artists and allows them to be creative, but it also demands they produce. It labels them workers, not artists, and this is something that the Golden Age developed. The Golden Age presented comics as work, as entertainment work, in fact, a lowly entertainment work. And perhaps the best example of this returns us to Siegel and Schuster and Superman, and the fact that they sold Superman for $130. Here's the very check they were paid by Detective Comics. Overall, the check lists a $402 payment, but If you see in the ledger side of it, the initial payment is for Superman $130. Ironically, they sold their comic rights without copyright for $130, and the check itself recently sold for $160,000. So Eisner points out the ambivalence of the Golden Age, the way it both gave birth to comics, but also created them according to a production scheme. I'd like to spend a little time looking at Eisner's later work in order to show you how Eisner works the page. Here we have a page from Will Eisner's Smellbound, part of his City People notebook, which was published in 1989. We're lucky enough here to have his pencils and his inks, and we can see that he is still using the 3x3 grid. There's 3 tiers very clearly, and those tiers are dominated largely by 3 panels. In the middle tier, we can see that Eisner has loosened up the grid to create 4 separate actions. But overall, Eisner's approach to this panel, in both the pencils and the inks, is to loosen up the grid by layering panels over panels, and by getting rid of the gutters entirely so that the action flows. In fact, Eisner's nicely married theme to content to structure, because if he's talking about smell, he's loosened up the page enough so that he's drawing a fluid movement of smell as it moves across the action. Form and content are one and the same, as we see a man getting home from work, entering his apartment, and a sense of smell pervades, indeed seems to come in that second panel of the first tier from apartment 4B, because it's literally pulling apart the door. As the man enters his own apartment and shuts the door, the smell continues until we get to tier 2, which the smell goes through the entire tier. Indeed, all panels are taken apart and wafted away by the sense of smell. The pencils actually show us Eisner playing with a little bit more of a dramatic break by inserting a door in the middle of the tier. In the finished version, there is no door. The smell moves even more effortlessly as the man first goes to sleep, then is awoken or can't sleep because of that smell. So happily he puts on his PJs and he goes downstairs. Again, each tier has a sense of tension that it resolves. The first tier resolves the sense that the man is inside his own apartment, happily smelling the smell. And then tier 2 furthers the action. It's parallel. The man is still happy, but now he's putting back on his clothes to go out, his PJs to go back outside. In tier 3, he's opening his door, and again, the smell is wafting out of 4B, and there is the one enclosed panel where the man is alone, knocking for entry. He enters, and there, well, what surprise, Mr. Lardy. You are here just in time for supper. And so he enters, and what a surprise it is. Overall, the smell is capable of moving through boundaries. And here we see that Eisner has written us a page and a poem of seduction. This, too, like Ultimate Spider-Man 78, is a poem of sexual seduction, in which the residents of 4B have captured Mr. Lardy's attention and drawn him in. It's also a poem of the seduction of the senses. For what Eisner's done here is created the one sense that comics don't have overtly, the sense of smell. He's created that visually, so we too are sucked in. And in that, he's created a seduction of the comics page. By dissolving the grid, you can smell the seduction. You can smell it. You're sucked in, just as Mr. Lardy is. And so this is Eisner's magic. He's created an interplay of the senses so that one sense substitutes for all. And this sense of substitution is at the heart of metonymy. And so I offer that Eisner's brilliance is not that he created the comic book and not that he created the graphic novel, so much that his understanding of the grid both asserts the grid as a powerful and containing force, but also dissolves it to bring comics to a new level.